is up, guys? Welcome back to Think Shank. We are back after a mini hiatus. It's the dead zone for the NBA. Anyway, we're finishing up August, which is notoriously the 1 month of the year where everybody, even those of us orbiting the NBA, take a break, take a vacation, and recharge, because as soon as get into September, preseason, and the actual season is underway, it is an absolute sprint for the next 9-ish months. So what I'm trying to do, at least for these more comprehensive analyses and thought work, I'm going to do less cuts, less of the jump cuts and stuff like that. The post-processing is absolutely awful, and it ends up not really mattering. If you're watching this anyway, sit back, relax, just listen to my beautiful, soothing voice, and I want to really share some awesome things. And I'm titling this upcoming series The Summer Break Takes, and that is in reference to what I did during the All-Star break. Hilarious, I know, the winter break takes. And what I want to do is just pump the brakes and look backward to look forward. Let's look at the playoff teams. What sort of quantitative outcomes, indicators did we witness? And then pop open the hood. What kind of underlying thematic qualitative observations or insights did I notice that I want to share with you all that kind of helped drove the outcomes we all saw? And then will give us a pretty solid foothold to project into next season. Of course, we're going to look at offseason acquisitions and trades and activity like that, but I primarily want to look at the past playoffs, analyze, synthesize what we're able to get our hands on, talk about specifically offense and defense, as well as key culprits behind those overall outcomes, my sort of thoughts, and then ultimately, of course, take a look at 2025. So without further ado, guys, it feels awesome to be back, and I'm really excited to jump into this with you. Number one is Oklahoma City. I probably should have started out by saying I'm going to start in order of seeding just for simplicity. I mean, I could go finals and backwards, but I don't know. That just felt less fun. So I'm going to start off here with the Oklahoma City Thunder. Round 2 playoff elimination, of course, to the Dallas Mavericks. Went on to play in the finals against Boston, but they finished as the first seed in the Western Conference. The absolute shitstorm, cutthroat, mayhem, chaos that is the Western Conference that's only getting worse into next season. And let's take a look really quickly at last season, regular and postseason. This team, pretty famously, if you didn't know this already, they were the youngest team in NBA history to win a playoff series. Granted, Zion having that hamstring injury really helps. But even in the regular season alone in the Western Conference, they still won 57 games, and their net point differential in the regular season was second in the NBA. How many points do you score? How many points are scored against you? A minus B. What do we have left? They were +8 in the regular season. Offensive rating, they had the third best at 120 points per possession. Their defensive rating was fourth at 112 points per possession. So you're really looking at the third best offense and the fourth best defense in the regular season. And then by net differential, how bad they were beating up on teams or getting beat up by teams, they were the second best in the NBA. So how did that translate then to the playoffs? Well, they went overall 6-4. They swept New Orleans in the first round and then lose to Dallas in 6, but they won 2 in that series. Overall, though, how did that differential offensive defensive ratings fare? Well, the net differential was third in the postseason, so that's inclusive of the play-in games. I want to just point out quickly, so technically 20 team sample size, because 10 from each conference at least get into the play-in. I don't make the rules. That's just what Cleaning the Glass does, and I just trust their data to death, so we're going to roll with that. But slight grain of salt, I guess, with teams like Sacramento, who beat Golden State but then lost to New Orleans, right? So they only played 2 games. So the sample size for them, maybe some of their numbers are inflated, deflated, but just going to have to roll with that. More of an indicator. That's all I want to say. So their net differential was 3rd of all 20 playoff teams. Offensive rating was 10th. Defensive was 3rd. So the change for a second-round playoff team who played 10 games in the postseason, their net differential went from 2nd to 3rd. Offense went from 3rd to 10th. And then defense went from 4th to 3rd. Let's start with the differential and defensive rating quickly. I think that those are incredible indicators just to start with. The net differential is really helpful for forecasting, your overall efficiency when you're thinking about expected wins or winning percentages. To have that be so consistently incredible and go from the second best to third best is amazing, and that's an incredible indicator of just a really, really strong team, obviously. But the defense holding steady too, even having an uptick in that postseason, especially when you inject that with the age component, the lacking experience of some of the guys on the roster, is just really, 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 really impressive. And foreshadowing for later, the offensive rating is really where things took a hit and I think ultimately led them to their demise in the second round, going from the 3rd best offense to only the 10th best. How did they do specifically? I just like to cover these for housekeeping. Against Dallas, interestingly enough, again, went 2-4, but their net differential in the series was minus 0.5 points. How in the world does the net point differential end up being a decimal? I'm not really sure. I know cleaning the glass cuts off some of that garbage time scoring stuff, so I don't really know, but biggest takeaway there is they basically scored the exact same number of points as Dallas did on them each way and lost in 6 games, which is really, really interesting. Offensive rating of 113, defensive rating of 113.6, about the same. And it's also pretty close to what they ended up averaging for the overall playoffs on both ends in that series. Again, 113 would be basically the 10th best offense of the postseason. Defense, that would have been definitely worse than their third place ranking, which is 106. And then against Dallas, it went up to 113. So wasn't obviously as good. But Dallas's offense was fantastic, as everybody's aware of. New Orleans, they swept them. Goes without saying, Zion Williamson going down in that first playing game against the Lakers. I'll eventually get to the Pelicans, but Zion Williamson was easily the best player on the court in that play-in game. He was sitting on a 40-burger before his hamstring injury in the final, 2 minutes of that game. And without him on the floor, Brandon Ingram and CJ McCollum were absolutely overtasked. Even with CJ's even though he was on such a super hot perimeter shooting streak to close out the season and in the play-in stuff, really just came to a halt when Zion was out because all the attention and all that stuff, having to shoot and facilitate, that's really not his game. The Brandon Ingram, on the other hand, dude looked like he saw a ghost, which I will unpack a lot more deeply, but if you've heard all the rumors about trying to trade him, this is why. The net differential in that series against Oklahoma City was plus 17.1 for the Thunder, meaning in total they beat them in total by 17.1 points. Offensive rating 112, defensive rating 95.1. If you hold a playoff team in 2024, 23, whatever, to 95 points a game on average, that's insane. Personally, I think that was a perfect storm, at least if you're an OKC fan, because, New Orleans' offense was just atrocious to begin with, but I also at the same time believe that Oklahoma City's defense is fantastic. The big kind of wrinkle there is really back to Zion because his unbelievable downhill pressure, he's probably the biggest downhill. It's like him, Anthony Edwards, and Ja Morant, probably the 3 biggest downhill pressure guys in the league. Zion literally, I think, might be number 1, not even kidding. And his just size and just physical build and stuff. Like, he's a literal power forward, and that is the biggest kind of question mark for Oklahoma City. Well, it was last year, and I think still will be moving forward, even with iHart, but is what it is. So I will say, I think that first round series against the Pels a little bit inflated their stats just because they were so weak and injury struck with their best player being out. But they really, really hung very, very closely with Dallas, the eventual finals Western Conference representative, in that second round series, that if you were watching it can probably recall that really late whistle on SGA on that PJ Washington corner three. Closed out in the corner, blocks the ball first, but then follows through and hits him on the arm. They called it a foul. I mean, I don't really have strong feelings about it. The underlying premise of all of that with refereeing just means it just has to be consistent. That's really it. I think it was in the Eastern Conference Finals or something. It might have been on that Siakam closeout on Jaylen Brown when he forced overtime. No, I don't think there was a foul call on that. I don't know. There was another really high-profile player who also got whistled for the same thing. So there was some level of consistency there. But I just say that to say that game was absolutely down to the wire in Game 6 and easily could have went to a 7th game. It's not as simple as just without that call, but just trying to refresh everyone's memory. So really quick over to the roster stuff. I just want to hit quickly, again, just table stakes. Starting unit, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander finished second in MVP voting. Absolute stud, mid-range master, probably the craftiest player in the league. There are two, Jalen Williams, second-year guy, finished, I think, in top 4, maybe he was 4th or 5th or something, in most improved player. Heartthrob of the league. Everybody loves him. He's incredible, and I totally support that. Lou Dort, Josh Giddey, Chet Holmgren. I am going to double-click on Holmgren and his incredible defensive potency eventually once I get into the player shooting stuff, but he was incredible. And then bench, you had Cason Wallace, also a true rookie, alongside of Chet Holmgren, Isaiah Joe, Aaron Wiggins, my personal favorite on this roster. I just love how composed he is. He kind of gives me Andrew Nembhard vibes a little bit, but obviously he's way more off-ball compared to Nembhard, but very, very young as well, but very, very composed, seemed very versatile, and I just really liked his demeanor. Hayward didn't even play, but Jalen Williams, the other Jalen Williams, J. Will, coming in to relieve Holmgren a little bit in this series, filling in at that spacer 5 role. So that's really interesting. I'm also going to touch on the starters differential lineups because I think that that's an incredibly powerful and indicative indicator of, changes that needed to happen and what to kind of expect. But I'm going to get to that after kind of the overall four factors or 4 key performance indicators for any team. Really, if you look on any of these analytics sites and you don't already know this, just really quickly, there are only 4 ways for any possession to end. It's your effective field goal percentage, which is you take a shot and you either miss it or make it. There is a turnover. You get stripped. You throw it out of bounds. Offensive rebounding, very self-explanatory, or a free throw. So these 4 indicators, again, are literally the only ways that possessions can possibly end, and what proportion, each one kind of comprises of the overall pie can be pretty indicative of your play style and areas to improve. So I'm going to just burn through both of them, and of course they apply both offensively and defensively, right? So let's just cover that really quickly. So offensively, points per possession, same thing as offensive rating. I already covered this. It was 112.7 points per possession. That would be 10th of all playoff teams, again, out of 20 total. Effective field goal percentage, they were 8th at 53%. Turnover percentage, they were 4th at 11%. And then offensive rebounding, they were 15th out of 20th at 24%. And then free throw rate, they were 13th at 17.4 attempts per 100 possessions. Flip over to defense now. They were 3rd of all playoff teams at 106 points per possession. Effective field goal percentage, they were second defensively at just 50.7%. Turnovers, they were also second of all playoff teams in 17%. 17% of the time they were turning the other team over. Offensive rebounding, they were 17th. Which in defensive terms is defensive rebounding. So that's really, really not good because they were 17th out of 20th teams at getting rebounds, defensive rebounds, not great. Free throw rate, they were 7th at only allowing 17.2 free throws for the other team per 100 possessions. So I just want to burn through that just in case you want to track along. But we're all talking about trends here, and I know nobody actually cares about numbers. It's just about takeaways. So what matters the most to me, I just want to touch off the top, is the defensive metrics. That was a really, really big thing that I think a lot of people in the commentary space or sports media space weren't really sure how it was going to hold up because everybody's aware playoff defenses, much more engaged, much more energized, and having these young kids, I think it was mostly a hedge on their mentals and the experience part. Like, are they going to be able to read and react in the moment to different offensive adjustments or schemes, etc.? And I think they blew that question out of the water. They were literally the second best team of all playoff teams in defensive effective field goal percentage, meaning they made the other team miss shots the second most of any playoff team. And then turnovers mentioned as well. They generated the second most turnovers per 100 possessions. And that is just really, really indicative overall. And their overall defense, again, was third of all playoff teams. So I think acknowledging again the note on New Orleans and the fact that they specifically had just absolutely shattered offensive firepower and ability to score anyway. So I would say as far as first round opponent level of difficulty, etc., a bit anomalous. But I think the overall trend here and takeaway is clear. This defensive scheme was extremely effective. And what Oklahoma City loves to do, and I'll get into it more in detail, is really that swarmy beehive idea where they're very, very quick. They are undersized, but they're very, very quick on the perimeter. They really like to get their hands in the cookie jar, and as soon as they dislodge it a little bit, they're going to jump on you and pile on like it's World War Z and they're a bunch of zombies. And they're going to rip the ball from you, and they're going to beat you down the court because they're all 16. So that worked really well. And then we'll also double-click into the offensive side, but again, that jump from third best offense in the regular season to 10th best in the playoffs, I'm just going to say it's foreshadowing. That is really the biggest culprit for them falling short against Dallas, despite the point differential of that entire series basically being equal on both sides. Now, what I want to get to here is the starter differentials, and it's important especially for Oklahoma City because one of their big adjustments, which you don't see very often among playoff teams, especially ones this good, is they changed their starting unit in basically the second half of the series where they replace Josh Giddey with Isaiah Joe, and we're all very aware of that. The floor spacing element was really tough. Giddey wasn't hitting enough shots from the perimeter, which allowed Dallas's perimeter defenders to sag off of him and really, really disrupt their golden boy in SGA as well as JDub from getting into that paint, generating the open kickouts, and their whole offensive scheme is just so dependent on that spacing. Also foreshadowing my really big question about integrating Isaiah Hartenstein offensively, but we'll get there eventually. The point differential when Josh Giddey was in the starting unit for the OKC Thunder in the playoffs was plus 5.6 points per possession. Their offensive rating was 108, defensive rating was 102. But when Isaiah Joe was inserted into that starting unit, and of course Isaiah Joe is going to come in at the 3, he's not that big, Josh Giddey's 6'8", so then they slid Lou Dort into that power forward position. which generally speaking is a really good bet to make. Probably would have done it sooner because all Dallas did with PJ Washington was park him in the corner. And even when he did attack closeouts and get to the cup, I really didn't feel like that was much of a threat to begin with. PJ Washington didn't have a lick of playoff experience as well. So I'll get to that in a second. Virtually the same exact number of possessions played with the lineup involving Isaiah Joe. Lou Dort slides down as Giddey in that 4 and then Dort in the 3. The differential was plus 19.3 points per possession. Offensive rating was 128.8, defensive rating 109.6. But the takeaway here is that with Giddey on the floor in that starting unit, they were only plus 5.6 in that differential, but then they inserted Isaiah Joe, and it was plus 19.3. Again, I think there was like literally only a 2-possession difference in the number of total possessions that each one of these lineups played. Their 2 most played lineups. That's like a 12-point swing in net differential. And then specifically, which I really want to highlight here, the offense was unbelievably elevated with Giddey off the floor. Their offensive rating went from 107.7 to 128.8 points per possession. That is basically a 20-point swing with Giddey off the floor and Isaiah Joe on. So if you're putting yourself in Mark Dagnall's shoes and his coaching staff, these are the kinds of observations you have to be making as far as eventually dwindling Giddey's involvement. And of course, you'll probably deduce you're weighing that against the defensive air quote downgrade of putting Lou Dort at the 4 and Isaiah Joe at the 3. Is it going to balance out? Well, the defensive ratings only shifted from 102.1 to 109.6. So really, they were 7 points worse defensively and then 20 points better offensively. So it wasn't even close. This is easily the biggest quantitative insight I've just managed to reveal even to myself. It's crazy when you actually look at numbers. And again, with playoff teams, you generally don't see adjustments to this caliber of literally shifting a starter out and a bench guy in, even though he's healthy and able to play. And just to see that level of swing is just really, really impactful. And it really made me wonder, at least, about that timing and pace of making that shift from the coaching staff. I'm sure there were a lot of intangible rationale there to keeping Giddey in there as long as they did, but when you just see that level of swing is just unbelievable. Next, playoff shooting. Last thing for this whole recap, and then we'll get into the thematic stuff. What I like to do is look at regions of the floor and every team's efficiency, how well they're actually shooting from that region, and then the frequency, how often are they shooting from that region, both offensively and defensively, to kind of unearth where they like to generate good shots from, where they are just really good at and maybe don't take enough shots from, and then where is the other team trying to really attack them from. So offensively, I have it split up between rim, mid-range, and three-point line. You can split up the mid-range, but for the sake of simplicity, I'm just keeping it as just one. Efficiency-wise, they were 13th, again, out of 20 total playoff teams, 13th in rim efficiency, 4th in mid-range efficiency, and 7th in three-point shooting efficiency. Frequency-wise, they were 14th at the rim, 7th from the mid-range, and then 8th from the three-point line. Trends, just looking offensively. Didn't shoot great at the rim and didn't really shoot at the rim that much. I think, again, thinking about the New Orleans series, which I kind of just want to almost sweep under the rug a little bit and just really, really just look at the Dallas series, I personally attest a good chunk of that to Daniel Gafford as well as Derek Lively. Incredible, vertical paint protectors. And also when you factor in the Giddey and the spacing stuff, them being 7th in overall mid-range frequency and then 4th in efficiency, the Thunder just shot really, really efficiently from the mid-range, and then they also took the biggest proportion of their shots from the mid-range. And One, that makes sense, again, with the Derek Lively, the defensive stuff. But also schematically, this is a good time to point out, I think the biggest nuance between the Oklahoma City Thunder offensive schema and the Boston Celtics, because the two get compared a lot, and if you just do a casual eye test watching the both, it'll feel very similar. But Oklahoma City has absolutely no problem with mid-range shooting, whereas Boston is much more wed to the Mike D'Antoni Houston Rockets. It's either a three or it's a layup. Very rarely you'll see guys really settling for mid-range shots, not trying to take shots at their golden boy in Jason Tatum or Jaylen Brown, but they're really not that good from the mid-range, especially when they're creating their own shot. SGA and Jalen Williams, though, completely different story. Those guys have earned the trust of the coaching staff to take mid-range shots. So it's just a part of how they work. I just wanted to take a moment to spotlight that because it feels a little bit casual, the degree to which a lot of folks are kind of lumping their styles of play together. There is a lot of overlap, but basically that release valve, as well as just overall ceiling, in my opinion, of offensive potency, is higher for the Thunder because everybody knows the mid-range is virtually unstoppable when you have guys as efficient as SGA. And I just think it's really notable. Also, their three-point shooting was interesting. I thought that they would have been more efficient, but 7th to 8th, they finished in the top 3 or 4, I want to say, in three-point efficiency, but their frequency, they were bottom 3rd in the regular season. They were really, really good at shooting threes because they generated really, really open shots because their guys could penetrate in and just kick out. And so I think as a team, they shot like north of 41% or something insane like that from three. But again, their frequency just wasn't very high. But you find that quite commonly, at least weirdly enough, with the Western Conference. I know Denver and Minnesota were the same way, where I'm pretty sure both of them were shooting. Well, Denver, by the end of their playoff run, they absolutely blew their own faces off by settling for threes, and they were all exhausted. So I think their overall three-point percentage ended up dipping quite a bit. But in the regular season, it was the same exact trend. So I just say that to say rim field goals, mid-range field goals, definitely still really, really big components of a lot of the most offensively potent teams' offensive kind of frameworks here. Quickly over to defense. Efficiency at the rim, 3rd of all playoff teams, 5th in the mid-range, 11th from 3. Frequency-wise, 10th at the rim, 13th from the mid-range, and 12th from the three-point line. Foreshadowing for Chet Holmgren being probably the second best rim defender in the NBA at the end of next season. Very, very much in play. The fact that they were the 3rd best rim protecting team in the playoffs on an undersized Oklahoma City Thunder team is an absolute testament to Chet Holmgren's incredible defensive potency and value. And even just being 10th in the postseason for the other team shooting just shots frequently at the rim is almost a win in and of itself, right? Because you think of an undersized team just going to get bodied, you're going to take into the hole, and you're going to get close enough where you're going to get a high percentage shot. That's not really what happened. And again, you look at their opponents with Dallas, Luka, Kyrie, they're outside-in guys, right? If you can slow them down at the point of attack, force them into the mid-range, which they obviously ended up doing, and then or you're forcing them to make that cross-court kick out to P.J. Washington because you're bringing help and you're not going to let Luka get to the rim, daring P.J. Washington to beat you, and then you lost that way because P.J. Washington ended up shooting, I don't know what percentage it was, but he literally led the Mavericks in scoring. P.J. Washington led the Mavs in scoring multiple games in this series, literally because of this reason, and also why they were only 11th in three-point defensive efficiency, like 11th best team at defending threes, is because they were like, screw it. I dare you, PJ Washington, with 0 playoff experience, to hit all of these open threes. We are not letting Luka eat us alive. And he did. That, to me, I think is the biggest reason why their 3-point defense was a little bit ducked. And it's also a big thing I'm going to look for indicator-wise looking at next season. Because these guys that have all this downhill pressure are only going to get better. Anthony Edwards, Zion Williamson, John Moran is back. Even Jokic, like, you are going to need to be able to find effective ways and schemes to slow down guys that can effectively get to the rim without giving up all these open threes as best as you can. And we basically saw exactly what happens when you were, making those adjustments that you had to with an undersized team or roster that they had last year. They were basically sending the low man up to Luka, refusing to let him get to the rim, and daring PJ Washington, and then he lit them up for like 26 and 29 points or 30-something points, I believe, one of the games in that series. Okay, so let's just synthesize all these things very quickly now. As I mentioned, the Dallas series was neck and neck. The point differential was almost literally equal. They end up losing in 6 games with that SGA late foul thing. Obviously, you can't just point to that to determine the whole thing, particularly when that Isaiah Joe for Josh Giddey switch ended up taking place about halfway through the series. I talked about the difference in the starters point differential there with Giddey versus Joe. Literally a 20 points per possession swing when Giddey went to the bench and Isaiah Joe went to the 3 and Lou Dort slid back to the 4 made complete sense to me, particularly when you consider PJ Washington was, one, just being parked in the corner and wasn't really attacking closeouts and finishing well at the rim anyway, let alone he has virtually no seeming ability to play make out of attacking closeouts. It's either he takes it to the rim. No, he just takes it to the rim, actually. And the whole lack of playoff experience thing as well. I really think they should have made that change earlier. But, again, intangibles, this team, so hyped up. The whole regular season, we're super dominant. Can Giddey find his outside shooting? I get it. But it is a very helpful indicator of the requirements of Oklahoma City's overall offensive scheme absolutely necessitating that spacing. Every single player on the Thunder's team offensively has to be able to shoot, or at least it did last year. Gonna bring some questions about Isaiah Hartenstein, a non-shooting big, and how he's gonna be integrated. But when it really gets down to the wire in the playoffs next year, I will bet my savings account on Isaiah Hartenstein not being there on the floor in crunch time. They are going to stretch the defenses out, and that is going to require Isaiah Joe, Aaron Wiggins, whoever, to be on the floor with these other guys because they need to allow SGA and JDub to be able to penetrate, get to the rim, get fouls, etc. Key culprits. Why did Oklahoma City end up losing? I know the point about the Giddey Joe thing. I think that is unfortunately a pretty big culprit, but I think ultimately, and again, looking at the fact the overall point differential was so close anyway, obviously that can't be the whole story here. I think ultimately it mostly rests on JDub and Chet's shoulders when it came to the offense. So I mentioned the offensive rating really, really sank from the regular season, 3rd best offense down to the 10th best offense in the playoffs. And that's even including an absolute blowout series in New Orleans where they had a 17.1 point differential. They just blew them out of the water. But then you go to Dallas, and they really, really struggled against Dallas's defense, particularly J-Dub and Chet Holmgren. Neither of them averaged more than 18 points a game in that series. Downgrades definitely for J-Dub. I think Chet too. I don't actually think so now that I think about it. But again, you think about playoff performers, you really need at least a second guy to be averaging 20 points a game, right? Even Boston, their closest analog systematically or schematically, Jason Tatum, Jaylen Brown are easily, they end up averaging in the playoffs, around that 20 points per game mark, but very, very consistent production from everybody else. But you know what I mean? It was, I think SGA ended up averaging like 32-7 or like 8-7 or something. it's really, really hard to beat the best of the best teams with one guy averaging 30 plus and nobody else averaging over 20. So that is just kind of your theoretical, just more like bench side bookkeeper analysis. The eye test will also validate that, and I think there are a couple specific reasons. Both of those guys are so young. I think their literal physical profiles are not done building yet, and that manifests itself in very specific ways. Like for me, it's JDub just needs to get to the free throw line more. It's legitimately that simple. And you have, I think Shea took the second most free throws in the league last year. No, I think he made the most number of free throws last year. I think Giannis had the most per game, but total made free throws, because he shoots like 89% from the free throw line. I think he literally made the most number. You got to get into the gym with SGA and start figuring out the foul merchant stuff. And, I mean, he already did this if you've seen the Instagram photos, but JDub needed to put on like 15 pounds of muscle, honestly. And you could really, really feel it in that Dallas series, because when he would get downhill and it was time to self-generate and self-initiate, he was shying away from contact and doing that kind of pet peeve, insane level of difficulty, like gliding left but like shooting right thing that he liked to do. Because again, I literally don't think he was comfortable taking the contact, but he is fearless. Like you see the guy jam on guys, especially in transition. He loves it. But, you know, high stakes game, he is super young or whatever. That's just going to have to be, one, a confidence and just fearlessness level from a half-court offensive perspective, but also, two, is the actual skill development in foul drawing, which, again, you are literally alongside of the best foul drawing player in total volume free throws made in the entire NBA. So that just needs to happen. Chet, super long as well or whatever. He seemed, you know, moment, pressure, what have you. Also being a legitimate rookie, I have a little more, you know, understanding for that on his end. And the fact that he basically carried this second-round playoff team to the third best rim defensive performance of any playoff team, virtually by himself. No one else on this team is over, at least on the starters, is over like 6'5" or 6'6", whatever Shea is, or yeah, basically when Giddey went to the bench. So that, and then the last culprit here, I think, is the offensive rebounding piece. I kind of skimmed over it quickly, but being 15th out of 20 total playoff/play-in teams in offensive rebounding when you're on offense is a schematic decision. That is Mark Dagnall telling the team, which they did all year, generate good shots, be patient, do the drive kick, washer, dryer, spin cycle, Boston Celtics thing, whatever, to generate high quality shots, because we are not going to be able to get the rebounds because we're too undersized. Get back in transition, make sure our half-court defense gets set as quick as possible because we're already working at a size disadvantage. So all that to say, that really high ranking feels intentional. The defensive offensive rebounding percentage, which is basically just defensive rebounding percentage, that is inexcusable. To be 17th out of 20 total playoff teams in defensive rebounding is absolutely untenable. And I think that is really what I'm getting at, is you can't do both. Like, you can forego and sacrifice offensive rebounding, but you have to get defensive rebounds. Like, you can't just lose that much of the possession battle. So I think that was the last culprit I want to call out there. The next point I want to call out quickly is an interesting quote from Mark Dagnall when he said after the series was over, our defense was worthy of winning the series. And I thought that was really interesting because, again, their net differential was basically even, and this was the first time I'd heard any sort of mention of that. I mean, maybe one of the broadcasters happened to mention it, but I thought that was a really helpful way of looking at and synthesizing kind of the series. As I've been alluding to constantly, is like the offense is really what led to their downfall here, particularly, number 2 and 3 guys and JDub and Chet. But I just really, really like Mark Dagnall as a coach, and his other mentions in that interview around not being able to coach the guys anymore because the whole series is done. I think he said at one point, I would like nothing more than to go in the gym tomorrow and coach these kids and guys again. An absolute joy or pleasure to coach or something like that. So really warm and fuzzies, but also schematically, I just thought that was a great way to sum up the series. The offense really let them down in the series, but the defense, no Hardenstein or Caruso needed, was absolutely worthy of winning against Dallas. And then the last point I want to say is I believe them and probably Dallas were the two teams where, I mean, Dallas different because they, brought in a rookie and then traded midseason, but Oklahoma City just had the best homegrown culture in the NBA. I think it was very apparent. They just loved each other a ton, and even that stunt in the playoffs where they just ignored the national media and then just went to their local guy. I don't know, slightly mixed feelings about that. Obviously, they didn't feel like they were given enough love and respect throughout the regular season and postseason for how good they really were. Blowing them off, I don't really know, but they obviously really, really care about each other and getting super fired up on the benches, and everything like that is just really, really cool. And I just think it is only going to get better because of how much success they did have, and the fact that they're etched in the fabric of NBA history as the youngest team to ever win a playoff series, no Zion, whatever aside, is still awesome. Ta-da! I am back the next morning. My camera died, and that should be something that everybody doesn't forget, unlike me. All right. So we are jumping into offense quickly for the OKC Thunder. The very first kind of overall takeaway I had was their stampeding model of drive kicks and the washer-dryer machine cycle, where you have homogeneous guard skills throughout most of the playoff rotation. Not only do you need very effective play finishers, whether that be making open perimeter shooting, but you need to be able to initiate. You need to be able to get the kickouts. If the shot isn't there, be able to put it on the deck, either finish or play make out of it. In addition, the idea behind the shot quality being way more important than offensive rebounding, kind of foregoing the possession battle, not investing a ton in crashing the boards because of their physical size deficiencies against most teams. That also proved extremely, extremely effective. Again, effective field goal percentage on offense, only coming down, to the 8th best of all playoff teams. But as I mentioned before, I think a lot of that came down to just being in the moment, able to really capitalize on some of the open looks on the shoulders of Chet and JDub. And then, of course, the ability or trust in the team's turnover creation or generation abilities, being extremely handsy and physical defensively, swarming guys on the perimeter or near to the basket, and then beating everybody in the foot race down the court, either for fast break opportunities or generating mismatches to ultimately take advantage of. Again, we're trying to win in the margins here, and given the size deficiencies, all of that, again, this is a tremendous masterclass in maximizing a roster with the talents and abilities that it has, even though, of course, there are some shortcomings, air quote. So ultimately saw that proved semi-viable. The reason why I say semi-viable is you ultimately need guys like JDub Chet to be able to be those play finishers, particularly against playoff-level defenses where you're probably not going to get a ton of very easy, clean outside looks. You just simply are going to need to be tough shot makers to an extent. And ultimately, I think, again, that's why their effective field goal percentage, offensive rating ended up taking a hit relative to the other playoff and play-in teams. The next point is around the egalitarian limits in the playoffs. An extension of the previous point, but I just really want to spotlight it. JDub and Chet still have to be able to shine and shoulder the offensive load in the playoffs. So looking a little more broadly and strategically at things, having second place MVP finisher Shai Gilgeous is incredible, and longitudinal historical data will show how incredibly important it is to have some of the top 7 to 10 players in the NBA when it comes to playoff value. Having a bunch of guys who are pretty good traditionally has not rendered that much success. It really, really does necessitate having a guy that prolific and effective, and ultimately Shai finishing the playoffs here, I have it right here, at 32, 8, and 7 on 51% field goals, 55% threes. The threes, obviously, volumetrically took a bit of a hit against Dallas. All of those stats were against Dallas. Cemented top 5 player, ultimate release valve, again with the mid-range being an area that OKC is more than willing to allow its guys to rise up and fire. Size, durability, physical profiles, finishing around the basket around guys like Gafford, Derek Lively, or your Rudy Gobert's, Jokic's, etc., is going to be a little bit tough. So they're okay with the mid-range stuff, particularly SGA, and having him really, really cement himself as a top 5 player in the league. Again, 32 points, 8 rebounds, 7 assists as a 6'6" lanky guard, far and away, an entire head and shoulders above the rest of the team as far as his offensive production, still being able to be that effective against your Derek Jones Jr.'s or whoever, testament to him. But the original point I'm talking about, the egalitarian limits in the playoffs, is even with a guy averaging 32 points in the second round of the playoffs against an eventual finals caliber opponent, you still need to have one or two other guys on this roster able to shine and shoulder some of that remaining offensive load. And again, I'm not trying to crucify JDub and Chet being a rookie, JDub second year, so it is what it is. The last point I did want to say is the unreal roster three-point percentage. I know in the playoffs they were only 7th overall in terms of efficiency and 8th in frequency. In my opinion, this is related to that egalitarian limits and allowing JDub and Chet to kind of shine. Pretty obvious and logical, but if these guys are able to be more potent offensively, draw more attention, it is going to unlock better outside shooting looks and just overall higher percentage shots for the remainder of the team. And the fact that during the season, the Thunder were, I believe, the third, fourth, definitely top 5 in overall three-point percentage as a team. Again, I think it was north of 40%. It might have even been 41% as a team they shot from the outside. That was still a very, very big weapon that the Thunder had. And while it did take a backseat a little bit in the playoffs, again, I think we all know kind of what it was really due to, not to mention the other notes about Giddey, having him ride the bench a little bit more, getting more of those potent shooters in there. So overall with the offense, Mark Daigneault, again, gets all of the accolades, being able to maximize this roster with its physical sort of deficiencies or shortcomings, really leveraging transition, and then the speed and guard skill prevalence throughout this roster to concoct this really, really effective offensive model. And I think the punchline here is it worked. Next, we have defense. When I think of the Thunder, I really think of a beehive. I don't know why. I mean, the closest thing is just the way that they swarm defensively, and all of them are just so quick and have guard-level awareness of passing lanes, being able to jolt out, stun at guys, run, sprint right back out, still be able to contest. It all feels a little bit reminiscent of that. And so being able to crowd those lanes, again, with the length, even though you are a little bit undersized, stun and recover, and being super handsy. So as soon as somebody gets into the lane, my brain goes to Jonas Valanciunas in the first round against the Thunder. On the Pelicans, the Pels obviously started off that series trying to force feed him down low and letting him cook, basically. But as I'm saying here is you really have to have sound footwork, great kind of handle, if you will, in the post to not get the ball dislodged. And we saw more than a handful of times JV didn't necessarily have that. And as soon as that ball gets slightly dislodged by one of these guys' hands, I mean, you're just getting swarmed by a bunch of bees. And then they're going to strip the ball. They're probably not going to get called for fouls. Side note thing, I'm not saying is completely a huge factor here, but I do think that does sort of play a role. These small guys can get away with a little more physicality. You hear that all the time on player pods and stuff. But being able to swarm these guys, rip the ball away, and again, beat them in the foot race on the court, really, really great leveraging of that sort of model, capitalizing in transition, that sort of stuff. The other thing I want to call out here is what was actually proven. Again, the thing against the Pelicans is just so difficult to, in my opinion, really take meaningful insights or conclusions from. But their time against Dallas, I think, was really their main, source of competitive analysis. And Dallas has such a solidified way of playing where they have, they're guard piloted with Kyrie and Luka. Everybody else is pretty static and ultimately led to their own demise against Boston. But we only saw OKC swarming beehive model in effect at the highest level against a team like Dallas. So I'm really curious about what kind of decisions they would have made against a Jokic-Aaron Gordon combination or Karl Anthony Towns, Rudy Gobert, etc. Obviously, Sam Presti, Mark Dagnall, we're looking very, very much down the line at that, acquiring Isaiah Hartenstein. But I just want to call that out. While I say the swarming beehive model has been semi-viable, I basically say it's been viable until proven otherwise. And again, the schematic opponents that we saw them up against is very much just a one mode of play style, at least on the defensive end. Another note that I had for Boston, too, because they really didn't play Embiid, Giannis, any of these powerful guys at the fours, fives, etc. So not necessarily a cause for concern. We just haven't seen it. And then last but not least, have to give flowers again to Chet. Being a rookie, the centerpiece defensively for this air quote undersized Thunder team, rookie of the year, deserving season. If we didn't have one of the best generational prospects join the league in recent memory. And then, of course, he offers a fair amount of offensive upside, particularly when you slot him at the power forward position, not the five, operating on the perimeter. We'll see what he's able to do against certain teams, mismatches galore, et cetera, et cetera. We'll see what his ball skills are and everything else. But leading an air quote undersized team to have the third most efficient defensive rim presence in the playoffs, I think is outstanding. And as I said before, would not be surprised if Chet Holmgren finishes this upcoming 2025 season as the second or third best rim protector in the NBA. Again, we'll see what his numbers translate to, playing more on the perimeter, depending on how they want to deploy Hartenstein. But him in this 5-out model, being the huge lone big man defending the rim, I mean, it was just outstanding. Even in the regular season, they were literally the best rim defense team. And again, Chet is the centerpiece of that. So huge shout out to Chet. And I really don't know if he gets enough love and credit for his work on that end. And that's why I say before about the offensive shortcomings that ultimately led, in my opinion, primarily led to OKC's demise of Dallas. I have a lot more understanding for Chet, being that huge anchor, especially against a team like Dallas with its rim running bigs and Gafford and Lively. So, is what it is. But he more than delivered on that defensive end and worth having be that centerpiece going forward. Really quick recap on the offseason. Obviously, they lost Josh Giddey over to Chicago. Sayonara. he's going to be great. That's its own sort of realm of commentary and analysis. I don't blame him for wanting to spread his wings and find his own way, almost. The Thunder have really amassed such a stockpile of just this incredible archetype of incredible defensive instincts and homogeneous guard skills and outside shooting and all this stuff that sticking up for yourself and kind of knowing your game a little bit, but wanting to be in an environment where you can prove what you can do and even just see what you can do, even if it doesn't perfectly align, with maybe what Chicago's doing, Zach LaVine, Kobe White, whatever. I just don't blame him at all. And frankly, I feel a little bad for the guy, considering the whole lineup shift for Isaiah Joe and how incredible of a swing it resulted in for OKC's potency. So losing his size in the starting lineup obviously necessitated some of the additions that they made. I'm going to start quickly with Alex Caruso. I know a lot of people took this to mean, this is unbelievable, what a steal, and they are so OP now on the perimeter. I'm not going to talk about the actual trade value and the assets and the fact that Chicago, I'm shocked, honestly, that's really all that they got for this trade, but that's its own thing. My biggest overall thoughts on this trade is, while absolutely Caruso is a phenomenal perimeter defender and his shot making, particularly from the outside and even more particularly from above the break, so not just corner three-point shooting, has been really, really great. I think he finished 41% last season DeRozan's playmaking gets overlooked quite a bit. I think Kobe White as well in that department gets overlooked, but he also came in from a situation without that many of his shots being assisted. So that is going to matter a lot because Oklahoma City, for all of its incredible movement and driving and dishing model, it doesn't result in a ton of assists. They were in the bottom third in the regular season last year just because a lot of these kickouts result in attacking closeouts, making plays from there, or hitting the release valve in the mid-range, finishing that way. Assists only qualify if you take, at most, 2 dribbles. So say that to say, Caruso's used to putting the ball on the floor, creating his own shots. So I think it's going to be a great fit offensively and obviously defensively as well. I just feel like I'm not completely certain how much this is really going to move the needle in total transparency here. When you think about their starting unit, as we get into Isaiah Hartenstein, having Chet move up to the 4, Dort at the 3, JDub at the 2, SG at the 1, Caruso coming off of the bench, while, again, is very, very helpful to relieve Lou Dort and the bench units, whoever their, the other team's microwave score is, he can obviously help neutralize that. I just don't know how much of a path I see for him to contribute or really just significantly move the needle, especially in that starting unit. Chet to the 5, Dort to the 4, Caruso at the 3, JDub at the 2, SG at the 1. Incredible defensive lineup, certainly. It'll be just very, very curious where it ends up leading as far as the power forward matchup with Lou Dort guarding Aaron Gordon, Karl Anthony Towns, PJ Washington, Jason Tatum, right? Like that 4 position is going to be, I think, the most important position to be watching for this OKC team. And pivoting now to the Hartenstein acquisition, it obviously unlocks more flexibility and creativity in your lineups. Dagnall is famous for his micro lineups where it's not about size, it's about time. Like, the guy is not afraid to just sub guys in for 2 plays and get them out. Made a name that way in the G League affiliate team with OKC and even before that. So definitely different looks and allowing Chet to play more on the perimeter. Again, when you think about Chet's incredible defensive potency, being the rim protecting 5, as well as enabling the 5-out offensive floor spacing model, Hartenstein is more than proven to be a potent rim protector as well. I think it's just going to be a very, very big question around the offensive elevation and utilization, maximization, whatever you want to say, with a non-shooting big in there, even though Hartenstein does possess things like his playmaking and whatever. So I'm going to double-click on that in a second. But the last thing I want to touch on, drafted Nikola Topic. I am not the biggest draft guy in the world, but I was fortunate enough to take a look at some of his footage and his tape before the draft. Makes complete sense to me with his size, vision, feel, whole thing European players have. It kind of reminds me of a more mature, less gunslingy Tyler Hero almost. Like really good feel and shot making and floor reading. I don't know if I can comment on his defense, but that was kind of the feel I got, where if he wants to very quickly rise and fire, finish around the basket, very, very solid finisher, much better than Tyler Hero. But just like that blend of like taller shooter, good shooting form, pretty good feel, secondary ball handler, etc. I don't even know if he's going to be in the U.S. for this actual season. He might just continue playing in Europe until they want to bring him over, which happens. But I just want to give him some love, too. It just really made sense from all the, reviews and commentary I heard around him, and then the actual tape I saw. Really just effective at getting to the basket, as well as understanding the spatial awareness, floor mapping to play make for them. So really good pickup by Presti. So looking at the ceiling factors overall now, the first and most important factor is the offensive leaps for JDub and Chet. So neither of them averaging more than 18 points a game in the Dallas series is a problem. Even with SGA finishing a well-deserving MVP caliber season, and even in that Dallas series with a point of attack, air quote, stopper, Derrick Jones Jr., I mean, SGA still averaged 32 points, 8 rebounds, 7 assists, 51% field goals, 55% from three. SGA is fine. SGA is great. He is magnificent, and that's incredible. And really what we needed to see these past playoffs was JDub and Chet rising to the moment, being able to embrace more physicality, getting themselves to the free throw line, slowing down the game. Again, both guys did exceptionally defensively, which we often do see with very promising prospects or two-way prospects. But that offensive potency, initiation, embracing contact, self-creation, all of those things. That is, in my opinion, going to be easily the biggest ceiling factor for the Thunder this upcoming season, forecasting to the playoffs. And then not that far behind is the offensive integration of Isaiah Hartenstein. So having a non-shooting big there eliminates the 5-out offensive model that OKC literally only used all season, including the playoffs last year. Even the other Arkansas, Jalen Williams, was a floor spacing big. Obviously, didn't play for a ton of minutes anyway, but that 5-out system was absolutely integral to how they finished with, such a relatively high effective field goal percentage and potent offense. Again, it was just kind of capitalizing on actual looks and things like that. I truly, truly believe, again, with Isaiah Joe and the lineup instead of Josh Giddey and Chet still at the 5, they had a 128.8 offensive rating against Dallas's incredible defense. Staggering the lineups with Hartenstein and Chet is going to be really interesting. There are going to be very obvious matchups where you simply cannot have Lou Dort, JDub guard the opposing team's power forward, I think, for long extended periods when you look at Minnesota and Denver and even potentially Boston, just for defensive purposes. You get an even hungrier and more seasoned Karl Anthony Towns out there who can kill you in a variety of ways, whether that be from the outside, barreling into you like a rhinoceros near the basket, trying to get there, always on the brink of making a charge or a block or whatever. it's just going to be tough for some of these guys to defend. So, again, that staggering with Hartenstein defensively is going to be interesting, and moving Chet up to that 4. Obviously, Chet, I mean, I think we've seen quite a bit of promise being able to switch on to smaller players, and his overall size just renders him a pretty good candidate, of course, for some of those bigger matchups, Denver, Minnesota, etc. But the brunt of the focus needs to be on offense. That was the biggest hit regular season to playoffs. 3rd best offensive rating in the regular season, 10th best in the postseason. JDub and Chet having to be more potent in that capacity, but now we need them to be more potent in a system potentially where you have to have Hartenstein out there for defensive reasons against Denver, let's say. How are these guys going to fare with reduced spacing now that you have a non-shooting big? I'd also be remiss not to mention Hartenstein very much proved himself not only as a pretty effective finisher around the basket with that wacky float shot thing at the bottom of the restricted area arc, and it's completely unstoppable because he's 7 feet tall and what have you. And so you think about baseline drives and stuff and a quick, sort of dump off pass and automatic kind of buckets there as you draw help. That's helpful, but he also proved, in my opinion, to be a pretty effective playmaker and facilitator. When you think about dribble handoffs, playmaking out of the top of the key, Hartenstein definitely proved to have some chops there. And I'm just going to be really, really curious how, if at all, they integrate that into their initiation protocol, especially when you think about how quick these air quote undersized guys are or could be moving off ball around an air quote hub like Hartenstein there. So it's not like I have a definitive can point to certain stats or whatever right now, but this is just me trying to highlight that we saw the shortcoming in action this past postseason. OKC didn't even play a high-level opponent that utilized its power forwards / centers to really be engines of the offense. They played Dallas, which is all guard piloted. This needs to be something that needs to be ironed out, practiced, gelled into their overall framework here. And so we're going to be expecting more from JDub and Chet on the offensive end, and potentially for certain matchups in the postseason, the environment we will be asking them to be more effective inside of will change, potentially slightly. So those are the two biggest factors to me as far as defining or kind of revealing what their ceiling could be. Their floor is just going to be incredible. You have a lot of very, very hungry guys who really love playing for each other and for their coach in Dagnall, who far and away exceeded expectations in the regular season. I guess besides the Zion injury, I guess you could even say into the postseason as well. Actually, you definitely could, because of the fact that they basically had the same point differential as Dallas in that 6-game series. So that is going to be really important to take a look at. And so ultimately, that's why I think regular season, their projected win total is 54.5 wins. I personally would hammer the over. I think the fact of their age, their hunger, their chemistry, their upgrades as well for, you think about just the regular season, having all of these rabid defenders, perimeter and otherwise now at the rim, Chet, help defense, Isaiah Hartenstein now, etc. I just think that this is potentially they won 57 games last year. This is potentially going to be close to potentially a 60-win team. And even more than that, they literally could win, I think, the most number of regular season games of anyone, especially when you consider Boston was so dominant last season and obviously winning the title. I don't think they're going to be too pressed to really have to push themselves to win so many games in the regular season. So seeding projections, I have them first or second for that reason. I think their floor in the playoffs next year is going to be around the second round. Even with the parity of the Western Conference, trying to think about, even if you finish first, who would be eighth. Got whatever, Houston, San Antonio even, Lakers, Sacramento. Based on how my current sense coming out of the playoffs and how I've seen this team fight, not to mention SGA's just magnificent effectiveness and potency everywhere, I have a hard time picking against them, against some of those teams I feel will probably orbit around that eighth seed. And then the ceiling, of course, is the title. I think they're more than capable of it, and even more intriguingly and awesomely is a potential matchup between them and Boston would probably be the most exciting series possible, almost, because stylistic similarities, and it's going to put each team's stars really on the ropes to be able to fight through this incredible perimeter barrier that each team will now have. Drew Holiday, Derek White, Jaylen Brown, Jason Tatum, Porzingis, if he actually plays, SGA, Jalen Williams, Caruso, Lou Dort, Chet Holmgren, or Hardenstein, Chet. It'll just be really, really interesting to me. And thinking about inserting Isaiah Hardenstein into that maybe unlocks some advantages for Oklahoma City, depending on how the integration offensively with iHart comes along. That is something that Boston can't really do. They don't really have another backup big. Jason Tatum, of course, built long, can defend other teams' bigs per se. But when you have two, one, you better have a Kristaps Porzingis that can actually play. And then three, how well could Jason Tatum even defend a 7'1", 3-level scorer in Chet Holmgren? So that would be extremely, extremely interesting to me. All right, guys, that's it for the first installment of Think Shank's Summer Break Takes series, Oklahoma City Thunder. This is a really, really fun exercise, getting the chance to synthesize, orient ourselves with how the playoffs went, not just from an outcome perspective, but popping open the hood, taking a look at the drivers and thematic storylines and all the enablers that led to set outcomes is really, really important. Examining the offseason activities, losses, acquisitions, and then ultimately forecasting, I think is just like a helpful, logical framework for having some pretty insightful discussions about the team moving forward. So thank you guys so much, and until next time.